Hey y'all, in this episode of Flick Connection, I want to tell you about 10 of the best new releases currently available on Netflix, and they're all very new. In fact, we've got 3 mind-blowing documentaries, a couple of hilarious comedies, a few thrillers, and even a new series that is perfect for movie lovers like me. Thanks to Sundays for Dogs for sponsoring another video. We'll talk more about them in a bit, but first, let's start with one of those mind-blowing documentaries with SKYWALKERS, a love story. If you're anything like my wife and heights make your hands sweat, you're gonna need a beach towel for SKYWALKERS. This is about 2 content creators or influencers, whatever you wanna call them, that fall in love as they're gaining popularity climbing huge structures. Skyscrapers, cranes. If you've ever seen any of the YouTube videos of like Russians hanging off of big structures like that, this documentary is loaded with that type of footage, and it is spine-tingling. Honestly, this would have been a totally interesting documentary if there was no love story at the center of it, but actually the love story hooked me way more than I expected it would have. In fact, I thought SKYWALKERS was miles better than most romantic movies. And as a content creator myself, I did identify with, not their struggle, but with their lifestyle a bit. Even though you're never gonna catch me anywhere near some of the heights they're at in this thing, it is wild. Another wild one that got criminally overlooked is Land of Bad. Now, I won't spend long on this because I have talked about it on some recent episodes, but this is kind of an excellent action movie. Yeah, Russell Crowe's in it. He's kind of the commander of this mission. He's manning drones for the most part, and I did like his role in this, but Liam Hemsworth is the lead, and this is a modern warfare flick. If you're into that stuff at all, Land of Bad is awesome. It's a lot like Behind Enemy Lines, but with an R rating, and you're in this jungle setting. It almost looks like Predator at times, aesthetically at least. I think Liam Hemsworth is highly underrated, and it's at the back of this list because it's far from a perfect movie, but if you generally like modern warfare things like this, Land of Bad is a banger. Longtime subscribers know I'm a sucker for heist flicks. Big ones, little ones, doesn't really matter as long as they're good and interesting, but if you love classic ones like Point Break and Heat nearly as much as I do, you need to see How to Rob a Bank. This is a documentary about a real-life bank robber named Hollywood. He operated in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest and robbed a ton of banks. They even hint at the fact that he was maybe inspired by Bodhi's character in Point Break. They also actually go to the movies in the documentary to see Heat, and it's a moment where they realize how much danger they're actually in robbing these banks. What's so great about How to Rob a Bank is you get law enforcement side of it, you get the actual bank robberies, both reenacted, animated, and tons of archival footage. But more importantly for this specific documentary, you get a very intimate look at the bank robber, the lifestyle that he was living, why he was doing the things he was doing. There are journal entries, all sorts of information that I thought were really interesting and kind of shed a new light on the life of a career criminal like this, a career bank robber. Again, if you've got a soft spot like me for heist movies, then this heist documentary is top-notch stuff. I also somewhat recently talked about how much I enjoyed Richard Linklater's new movie Hitman, which is another Netflix original. And one of the reasons I liked it so much is because, yes, it's a romantic comedy, but it doesn't go through nearly any of the standard beats you get in a romantic comedy. I mean, Glenn Powell is great as the lead actor. He's actually very funny in this movie, but he's got a standard rom-com, Anyone But You. It's on Netflix. I thought it was funny, but it's very standard stuff. Hitman is not. The setup on paper sounds kind of like the setup for a basic rom-com, but the movie's actually kind of half focused on this romance and half focused on this guy's career impersonating various hitmen in order to capture the people trying to hire hired killers. That whole concept is based on reality, but they ham it up for the movie, and it is fun. And then the romance stuff, while it does feel like a rom-com at times, it ultimately goes to not just a different place, I think a pretty interesting place for a romantic movie to go. Not mind-blowing stuff, but if you've been disenchanted with rom-coms or even just Netflix original comedies in general, then Hitman is maybe fresh enough to change your mind the way it did mine. Next up, I've got another killer documentary and a totally badass flick from India that nobody's talking about. But before that, I do want to speak to the dog lovers listening, because today's sponsor, Sundays, actually extended the life of our dog, Peanut. In her old age, we noticed Peanut suddenly stopped digesting the food we were giving her. Food that we thought was premium quality food. Her body was just rejecting it, and she was beginning to waste away, and we literally thought her days were numbered until we started trying fresh dog food brands. And those did work, but I was honestly grossed out by them. They would spoil in the fridge, they were kind of a mess to prep and clean up, and Peanut, as a dog with no teeth, she made a real mess with that wet-ish fresh food. Sundays is a completely different animal. And that's because Sundays is air-dried dog food that contains 90% human-grade meat, meaning meat that's safe for you and I to eat. The other 10% is vegetables with 0 synthetic ingredients. And because it's air-dried, Sundays is shelf-stable. That means no spoiling in the fridge, no messy prep or cleanup. You just dump it in the bowl and they gobble it up. So Sundays gives your dog better nutrition than typical grocery store food can, but Sundays can also save you money. Because it's shelf stable, they're not having to spend money on refrigeration packs to get it to your door. They're just focused on a short list of premium ingredients and they pass the savings on to you. In fact, Sundays can cost 40% less than other fresh dog food brands, but for a limited time, my viewers can save 50% off their first order with Sundays when they use my link in the video description, or just type in sundaysfordogs.com/flick. Again, you're gonna save 50% off an already great price, and you'll be giving your dog better nutrition. It's a fantastic deal, but speaking of great stuff, let's get back to this list of Netflix movies.
Prosecutors allege a love triangle turned fatal.
I was starting over as a single person, and I was determined to enjoy it. That's when Carrie Farver came into my life.
I promised a killer documentary, and next up we've got Lover, Stalker, Killer. Now, I think Netflix does a great job with true crime documentaries, but this one's kind of special. On paper, the story's not nearly as big or dramatic as the one in How to Rob a Bank, but the delivery of Lover, Stalker, Killer is chilling. It's actually a very interesting story. If someone were to just tell you this story on the street, it would either blow your mind completely or you just wouldn't believe it, because it's fairly unbelievable. But as the title would suggest, there's some loving going on in this one, some stalking, and some killing, but everything else in between is way wilder than the title would suggest. Not only does this documentary outline some unhinged stalking of one guy in particular that the story focuses on, but the way in which this stalker and ultimately killer were captured, I thought was just as interesting as what they were up to, and that's why this one gets ranked so high. If you typically love true crime stuff, especially stuff that's kind of entertaining, I mean, this one does go to some dark places, but it's not as grim as true crime things can be, particularly ones that involve stalking. That said, it's fairly accessible, and again, absolutely mind-blowing. Now, Netflix actually has one of the bigger, more talked about movies to come out of India in the past year. It's titled Maharaja. Over a year ago, they added RRR, which was a huge global hit. It got nominated for tons of awards. People loved that movie. And now they've got Maharaja, which is fairly different. This one's darker, it's sadder, it's much more brutal when it decides to be. Now, do not go into this one expecting an all-out action movie. I know the trailer kind of makes it look like that. When there is action, again, it's brutal and it's raw and fairly realistic. It's a little over the top in Hollywood, but for the most part, this is a real gritty movie with a mysterious story. Like, it's gonna almost make no sense up front, and as you progress through, brick by brick, the story starts to fall into place, and I thought it was excellent. I'm not really surprised by movies very often anymore because I watch so damn many of them, but when I am, a movie earns big points, and Maharaja surprised me with its storytelling. Not just in how good the storytelling is, but the story that unfolds actually has some meat on the bone. on top of being, you know, this movie with some brutal action revenge sequences. It is foreign language, you will have to read subtitles for this one, and it's quite long, but if you enjoyed RRR, again, this one doesn't have any of the levity that one had, but it is still a real gem from India. Now, I promised a couple of comedies, and I do think Hitman is funny. It's a good comedy, but it's not a real knee slapper. My next one had me in tears, and I honestly don't think I've laughed this much at a Netflix original movie, maybe ever. And there are ones I like Dolomite Is My Name. I don't think they made me laugh nearly as much as Incoming.
What the f even is ketamine?
I think it's for cats or something.
It's for cats. Or something.
But this has got a specific brand of humor. I'll say, if you love Superbad or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, go watch this movie, you're gonna love it. If you don't connect with the comedy in either of those, I really don't think you're gonna connect with Incoming at all. Two writers from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia wrote and directed this as their first movie. It's got banter, the way Sunny always did, but it's also a coming-of-age high school story about some freshmen trying to go to a party, trying to meet girls. It's got all that stuff, but it's genuinely really funny. I'll also say, if you've got a weak stomach and the sight of bodily fluids disturbs you, this it's a wild movie. It's R-rated. It's got multiple gross out moments in it that were honestly too gross for me at first, and then when I saw where they were going with it, again, I was in tears. If that sounds like you, hopefully you love Incoming as much as I did, but if you don't like crude humor, you're going to potentially hate this movie. And then my number 3 pick is not a movie, it's a new series, but it is for people who love movies like I do, especially movies from the 80s and 90s. I'm talking about Terminator 0. This is a new anime series based on Terminator. James Cameron is involved with the writing, and the story has a lot in common with Terminator and Terminator 2. In fact, this is essentially a Japanese version or even retelling of the initial Terminator story and timeline, or at least that's kind of what it feels like. It's got a beautiful Japanese animation style, like it's really well done. The show starts off with a bang. It's got a great opening sequence, and maybe because it's Japanese, they actually take some time to touch on some of the time travel paradoxes and explain them, I think, better than any of the Terminator movies did. If you love the first 2 movies like I do and you haven't really enjoyed anything else they've put out since, I don't know, I like Terminator Salvation, but I get why people don't like it. Still, I will say Terminator 0 is not just surprisingly good. This is legitimately the best Terminator property released since 1991. Now we're gonna jump to my top 2 picks. One's a brand new release, the other one was a huge release late last year, but I do want to give you 2 recommendations for the family very quickly. One is Orion in the Dark. This is a Netflix original movie about a young boy who's terrified of everything, and the dark comes to life one night to teach him that the world's not so scary. It's got a bunch of great little clever characters. It's actually got a lot in common with Pixar's Inside Out. And I also thought Migration was actually a beautiful movie that's not related to any other franchises. Not only is it visually stunning, but it's got a good story. I think those are 2 of the best movies to watch as a family on Netflix right now. But my next pick, my number 2 pick on this list, is not one to watch with the family. It's also the newest movie on this list, Rebel Ridge.
So I was thinking, what if we just walk away?
Well, now you're starting to talk.
I was like, nah.
Now this is director Jeremy Saulnier's second Netflix original. Hold the Dark was his previous one, and Rebel Ridge does not go after really lofty ideas like Hold the Dark did. That movie was a bit confusing, but interesting. Rebel Ridge is much more straightforward. You essentially understand everything on the first watch, And this director also did two of my all-time favorite thrillers, Blue Ruin and Green Room, two just incredibly tense movies. Now, I did really enjoy Rebel Ridge, but it doesn't really feel like any of his other movies. It's not quite as dark and brooding, but it's still very interesting. You follow an ex-Marine who's facing off against some corrupt cops in a small town, and even though he's black and I think all of them are white, almost all of them, the reasons why he's facing off with these guys just end up being more interesting than another movie about racist cops. Don Johnson's one of the bad guys. He is fantastic. I've loved everything he's been doing over like the past 10 years. I'll also say, if you're into jiu-jitsu or even just MMA, this is not really an action movie. It's not loaded with brutal action, but when this guy decides to put his hands on somebody, again, if you're into jiu-jitsu, I think you're gonna dig where this movie goes. One of the better Netflix original thrillers I've seen in quite a while. And then my number one pick got nominated for all sorts of awards. Not only that, but like Steven Spielberg and other filmmakers praised this movie in ways that they never do. Godzilla Minus One. Now, this is actually a big budget Godzilla movie to come out of Japan. I say big budget. The budget actually pales in comparison to big budget American movies, and the way they made this in Japan was kind of old-fashioned. Now, the movie's full of CGI. It's not that old-fashioned, but they did use practical effects, and they set up a fantastic story. Not only do they paint this great picture of a post-World War II Japan, and when I say post, I mean like the war just ended in this movie, but the story makes all sorts of connections between the war and this Godzilla monster. The depiction of Godzilla is great, and there are multiple sequences in this movie, particularly the one with the wooden boat and the mines, that just stand out as something exceptional. Netflix has a decent dubbed version. You really are probably better off watching this particular movie in Japanese, and if you want a real kind of old school experience, Netflix also has a black and white version of this same movie. You will have to look for the two versions, but I highly recommend these for movie lovers, especially if you love classic Spielberg like Jurassic Park and Jaws. You're gonna dig Godzilla Minus One, which is why it's my number one pick. Don't forget to go check out the Sundays link down in the description, or just go to sundaysfordogs.com/flick in order to start feeding your dog better. But I will keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Netflix episode, and you will see me on the next one.